Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Developer Express. Become a UI superhero with Dev Express controls and libraries. Deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today. By leveraging your existing knowledge, you can build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. You can download your free 30-day trial at dx.hanselminutes.com. That's dx.hanselminutes.com. Hi, everybody. This is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today I'm talking with Chris Ferdinandi from GoMakeThings.com. How are you, sir?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks. How are you?
I am lovely and happy to be chatting with you today. I've been checking out GoMakeThings.com, and you've got quite the side hustle here. You've got a blog, and you've got a newsletter, and you've got guides, and you do mentoring, and you do open source. There's a ton of good information up there. It's a great domain.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's about 5 or 6 years worth of just brain dump all in one spot.
Yeah. And I see also that you do JavaScript mentoring, and that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about because I feel like there's been a lot of JavaScript frameworks that are coming and going, and I see people trying to decide which framework to use, and it feels to me like they're not just saying, why don't we just use JavaScript?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's a thing I hear a lot. In fact, one of the things when people sign up for my newsletter, they get this kind of auto thank you from me that asks just one question: what's the thing you struggle with most as a developer? And that is hands down the thing I hear the most about is I don't know what framework to pick. I don't know what to focus on next. There's so much to know. I don't know where to start. There's some variation of that theme. Just comes up over and over and over again. And so a big part of what I like to do is help developers, especially people who are newer or kind of that early to mid career, really just kind of help them figure it all out. Because I've been there before and it's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. I get 3 or 4 emails a week from random people who say, I want to know if I should use Angular. Where do I start? Angular seems to be like, they think that they're saying Angular like the framework, but I really feel like they're using the word Angular as a proxy for like any JavaScript framework that will do more for me than JavaScript itself. But it seems like those frameworks are so opinionated that I'm really asking about like, which religion should I pick? And I don't know what to tell them.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. Religion's a great way to describe it because people get really dogmatic about it. I try hard not to be, but I can at times be just as religious, for lack of a better word, about just using plain old vanilla JavaScript as some people are about their frameworks. And I was trying to be cognizant of that. Part of the bias here is I haven't really worked on projects where using a framework would benefit me to the point that I think some of the costs of using one outweigh it. So I'm aware of that, but I still kind of I fight vehemently against frameworks a lot of times, just because I both see them overused and I feel like we have a framework problem. It's not that frameworks are bad, but we seem to, as a community, churn out new ones so frequently, and then we have like almost professional ADHD, so we get bored really easily and then move on to the next thing, and It all just kind of fuels this stress around not really knowing what to learn or feeling like as soon as you learn something, your knowledge is already out of date. And I've kind of in a moment of Zen moved past a lot of that anxiety, but I still see so much of it in our industry. And yeah, sorry, that was a very long-winded way of saying I can be religious in the other direction, although I try not to be.
Well, yeah, because I think that one could argue that just as people are discussing the concept of minimalism in one's life, like you have too much stuff, you should embrace minimalism and have only 100 things. That could arguably be maybe too far the other direction. For me to imply that Angular has no value or jQuery has no value would be perhaps considered a kind of extremism on that on that continuum where you have use all the frameworks on one side and use only vanilla JavaScript on the other side. Certainly, these frameworks have value. So maybe is it an appropriate question when someone says, should I use jQuery? Should I use Angular? Is the question, how do I determine if a framework has value for me?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair way to frame it. And I had a similar discussion not too long ago with Chris Coyer and Dave Rupert, because this had kind of come up, and one of the I think there's some clear value you can get out of a lot of frameworks and libraries. There's things that they, honest to God, just do better than vanilla JavaScript, and then there's, I think, a lot of areas where they kind of fall flat, and there's not a good evaluative criteria, for one. And then the other, I think the other problem we kind of struggle with just broadly as an industry is developer ergonomics seems to oftentimes be valued more heavily than all other factors. So
developer ergonomics.
Yes. And the first time I heard that phrase, I had no idea what it meant either. So sorry. So specifically how comfortable and easy writing the code is for the developer. So I'll use, just as a really simple example, jQuery, where people often love to point out that something that might take 10 lines of code in vanilla JavaScript can be done in 1 or 2 in jQuery. In part because all of the helper methods you might write to do a thing are already included, or you can chain methods instead of having to kind of write them out individually. Kind of the hidden subtext there is supporting your ability to write a script in 5 lines instead of 20 is you're also loading an additional 85 to 90 kilobytes of minified code to do that thing. And that's kind of an extreme example, but the big argument I often hear in favor of using these is they allow you, the developer, to write less code, even though the overall code you're including in your code base may be orders of magnitude larger than you need. So I've never found that to be a particularly compelling argument, but it's the one that seems to come up often, or it's the thing I see focused on a lot when we talk about a lot of these tools. It makes it easier for me to get the job done. And I don't want to downplay that, like that's important, but I also don't think it's necessarily the only thing that matters or even the most important thing that matters.
Do you think that we are, as a community, or maybe this is just about me, am I hiding my lack of understanding of modern JavaScript by trying to fill that gap with hunting down different frameworks and elements that I don't necessarily need?
No, that feels a little unfair. I think the other piece here, so where all of the different, not all of the different, but most of the different libraries and frameworks really kind of win, or can win, is around documentation and getting started. And some of them do a better job of this than others, but jQuery is, and I'll keep coming back to it just because it's so ubiquitous and it's been around forever. But is kind of the shining example there of like anything you want to do, you can go to jQuery.com and find a really clear piece of documentation with a lot of examples around how to do it with jQuery. And with just plain vanilla JavaScript, there's not a one-stop shop for all things. And then probably one of the best sites for it is the Mozilla Developer Network, or MDN, but a lot of their guides are either inaccurate, incomplete, slightly out of date, or written in a way that's really more appropriate for intermediate or advanced developers rather than to beginners. And so it's just really alienating and unapproachable. And so from that perspective, I think it's if you're a beginner developer, I'd love to see you writing working code as quickly as possible. And I don't necessarily care if that's with vanilla JavaScript or with something else. I learned on jQuery and then kind of converted over. But I just think kind of from a confidence perspective and from a feeling like, hey, this thing that seems really intimidating, I can actually do. Like being able to write working code is, one of the reasons I keep doing it is because it's like the best high. Like I just get such a thrill out of what we can do with, a text editor and a web browser. The flip side of that is one of the reasons why I do what I do, why I write the guides, why I write the daily, newsletter and articles, is I really want to show people that you can do a lot of this stuff just as easily in vanilla JavaScript as you can in jQuery or some other framework. A lot of the things that people use some of these other tools for, basic DOM manipulation, are just as easy to do without any tools at all. And the problem is really just that the documentation around it sucks. So my pocket guides are an attempt to create better beginner-friendly documentation that comes with some real practical exercises to help you kind of reinforce what you're learning.
The thing that hit me the most about what you said was that, people who make Angular or jQuery have a framework and they have a project. It's an open source project that they are incentivized to create great documentation for it. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
But JavaScript itself doesn't really have like a place. Like it's a standard, it's a thing, but there's, other than like W3 schools, which we should all block at the host level. There's no like place, right? It's not a thing that is promoted. So who owns making those great tutorials and that great documentation? And it's kind of like the collective. So a combination of that plus the ubiquity and the early adoption of jQuery is all kind of added up to this perfect storm, as well as the crappy branding, with all due respect, of JavaScript as ES6, which the kids don't want to learn.
Yep.
It kind of adds up to this perfect storm of like, well, I'll just go to get a framework. JavaScript is glue. It's certainly not feature rich enough for me to use, is I think what people think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also kind of this, because we talk about, ES6 and especially now where new features, like they're really pushing for this annual release date. But, I have already heard talk about ES8. And ES6 features haven't even been fully implemented by...
I'm already stressed out thinking about it. Well, I'm looking at es6-features.org. Yeah. And it's like, oh, man, that's a lot of stuff to learn.
More stuff to learn, right? And and it's... part of the problem is with the way these things are named, it never feels like there's completion. So like if I want to use ES6 stuff, there's still this, and that's the technical name, ES6 stuff, of course. No, but there's still kind of this perspective that, okay, so if I want to use this, I either need to kind of give the proverbial middle finger to people who are using anything but the latest browsers, or I need to open up Terminal, install Babel, run some complicated transpile process beforehand. It's like that Hacker Moon article that was making the rounds last year about what being a modern JavaScript developer involves, where it's just all these complicated things, and then I need to use a module bundler and all that. And it's like, that's really overwhelming. And I kind of had an epiphany not too long ago. I've been avoiding ES6 for a long time because ES5, came out I think 6 years ago now. It has terrific browser support all the way back to IE9. You can literally just open up a text editor and go. And I realized not too long ago that a lot of these super handy ES6 kind of methods and functions, you can start using today without any sort of kind of compiling process, just by throwing in a few simple polyfills.
Okay.
So I've started kind of keeping a collection of the ones I use, and it just it makes writing JavaScript a lot easier. The other thing, we talked a little bit about the stress of like, all this stuff I have to learn. And Sarah Swidon has influenced me quite a bit here. She often talks about how she doesn't bother learning anything new until she absolutely has to use it on a project. And, so like you should be aware of things. Like I know that ES8 is a thing that's being worked on, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to kind of make development of certain things easier. But, until I'm at a point where the tools I already have and use are insufficient for accomplishing that task, like there's just no real need for me to go learn all that stuff. So I will delightfully hold off until such a time that I need it. Fetch is actually a really good example of that. Kind of fetch is the thing that's supposed to replace XHR for AJAX calls in JavaScript. And and everybody's like fetch and promises and fetch and promises. And I read about it all the time. And if you're still using XHR, you're totally missing out. And I tried to use it the other day, and I finally settled down to learn it because I'm like, okay, everybody's saying it's better. Let me give it a shot. I actually found that because it's still kind of in development and not widely supported, XHR meets my needs better today than Fetch does. It does certain things that Fetch can't right now, or does them with fewer lines of code. So, yeah, I'm sorry. That was a very long and rambling kind of thing. But
okay.
Yeah,
I think we need to back up though a moment.
We absolutely do.
People understand. I want to parse some of this out. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Please do break it down.
So when you say polyfill is a thing that a gentleman named Remy Sharp came up with in 2010. So almost 7 years ago now.
Yeah.
And I think of it as being like spackle or putty. If you have a crack in your wall, you spackle over it. You putty over that to make it smooth. This takes APIs and it's a shim basically. So it's like, I have one browser that supports the JavaScript location API, and I have another one that doesn't support it at all. I don't want to go and say, write code that says, if running Netscape Navigator, that would be horrible, right? So I just want to ask for their location and get it, and you figure out how to do it. Is that what a polyfill is?
Yeah, it effectively bolts functionality into browsers that don't support them, using the native syntax. So rather than having to do, if browser supports this, do one thing, otherwise do something else. The polyfill kind of does that behind the scenes, and then you just write kind of the modern to specification JavaScript. Let's say a good example of that, for example, might be one of my personal favorites right now is matches, which is a method you can use to take an element and see if it would validate as true against a particular selector. Instead of having to do something like if it has a class, or if it has this ID, or if it has this class plus this data attribute set to this value, you can just kind of use a CSS selector, and it'll tell you if the element matches all of those kind of things. Works in, I think, IE9 and up, but a lot of older browsers used a vendor prefixed version. So like if you're back in kind of the IE9 era, or some older versions of Chrome or Firefox, it's going to be prefixed with IE or WebKit or whatever. And the polyfill for that just kind of checks to see which version is supported, and kind of swaps out that version for the official specification of matches. You don't have to write 4 different versions of that code to do the same thing. It just handles it for you. And if you're in a browser that doesn't support matches but supports query selector, it will go and kind of run some other thing to kind of simulate what matches does and get you the same result.
And you're a big fan of poly. You think polyfills are like, if you're going to use a framework, maybe just use vanilla JavaScript, and when you hit a wall, find a tiny polyfill.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of polyfills. In large part because they let me just focus on writing code, and I don't have to kind of think about which library or framework I have to use. Like modern JavaScript is very, very capable. It's just not evenly distributed, and polyfills help distribute it more evenly. The other thing is, much like these days, I make sure all my content is accessible to browsers like IE6 or IE7, but I'm certainly not writing JavaScript enhancements for those browsers. And at some point we will hit a threshold, or we'll hit a point where a lot of the things that I'm polyfilling today have broad enough support that I'm going to say, okay, if your browser doesn't support that, you just don't get this enhancement. Polyfills are meant to be deleted, which is awesome. So like when you hit a level of support that you're comfortable with, you can just pull it out, and then your code base gets smaller. Whereas libraries and frameworks, by their very nature, tend to get bigger over time as more features get bolted in. Writing things with polyfills means you rely very heavily on what the browser does natively, and your code gets smaller over time, which is better for the end user, and in a lot of ways better for you. You just have less stuff to kind of manage.
Do you create a lot of JavaScript plugins?
Yes.
And I think people who are listening to the show have heard the term jQuery plugins.
Yes.
But they may not necessarily realize that JavaScript can have plugins, or how that would be a thing and how that would structure. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually had this conversation not too long ago with Dave DeSandro, the guy who made Flickety and Masonry and a lot of really popular kind of JavaScript plugins. We both call the things that we do plugins, but it's really not an accurate term for them, because plugins typically involve bolting additional functionality into like a framework or a library or something like that. And what we write are probably more accurately called like modules or components, because they're giving you a set of features. They're not necessarily extending any particular library. You're just using a bunch of JavaScript to write something that does something. But I still like the term plugin, because I think it's honestly, just from a marketing perspective, I think when people think of things that do the type of stuff my plugins do, they're thinking of a plugin. Module or component doesn't necessarily have kind of the same meaning in a lot of, at least for the type of audience that I tend to write code for, doesn't necessarily have the same. Yeah,
it's a more accessible name. It's a name we all understand, so that makes sense.
Even if it's not the most technically accurate. So really, what I'm doing is I'm taking a whole bunch of kind of lower level JavaScript functions and methods, and building some functionality on top of them. And then abstracting out a bunch of stuff for people so that they can kind of just get on with their project without having to do too much work. And I'm always trying to, I think, balance kind of the weight of the code against making it easy for kind of beginners to get started, or make it easy for people to do stuff without kind of hacking the core code too much. And that for me is, I think, what kind of the difference between, for me anyways, what I would call a plugin versus like a helper function. So a helper function is something where it's just, it's kind of this little bit of code and you can modify it to suit your purposes. Whereas a plugin is a thing that that when you run it, it potentially accepts some options or some configurations, or you're able to kind of modify or customize it for your project without having to actually touch the core code. An example of this, I have a plugin called Smooth Scroll that animates scrolling to anchor links. And there's a ton of jQuery plugins that do this too, but this one's vanilla JavaScript, so it doesn't require any dependencies or anything. And you can do things like customize which selector actually triggers an animation. So maybe you want to apply it to all anchor links, or maybe you only want to apply it to anchor links that have a particular class. You can do things like pass in options to specify the type of easing that the link is going to use when it animates. I even make some of the kind of the lower level functions that run internally available externally. So if you want to just animate to a random point on a page by passing in like a pixel point down on the page, like let's say you want to scroll down to the 1000 pixel mark on your page just because, you can do that by kind of calling one of the public methods I expose in this plugin. So I will often get requests for things like features or functionality. And because I kind of have these set of configurations and options available, most of that stuff I can kind of show people how to do without ever touching the core code, which is great for them because they can kind of build on top of it. It's great for me because it keeps the code base lighter and I don't have to do as much feature development. But yeah, that's just when I think about plugins, that's kind of how I think about them. But that's just a 100% kind of personal bias on here. I don't think everybody kind of thinks about plugins in that same way.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to talk about was a little bit more about jQuery, because I feel like jQuery really made a big difference in the community. It spackled over, it polyfilled over, and perhaps continues to cover up a multitude of sins of incompatibility and tries to like level the playing field for the web.
Yes.
But even as recently as, well, as far long ago as 3 years ago, you wrote an article called Ditching jQuery, which is effectively a huge, I don't know, not a manifesto, but it's a complete guideline of saying, here are all the things you are using jQuery for that you shouldn't. How do you balance that? Like, here's an article on how to ditch jQuery with the absolute value that we can all acknowledge jQuery provided to the community.
Yeah. And, before we get into that, as much as I rail against jQuery, it's one, how I learned how to write JavaScript. And two, it has, I think more than anything, had such a big impact on the modern APIs that I now anyways take for granted. So things like being able to just select elements without having to just do it by ID or class, like being able to select by any set of CSS selectors. We owe jQuery for that. Being able to easily add and remove and toggle classes. We owe jQuery for that. A lot of the new ES6 stuff like prepend and after and remove. We owe all of that to jQuery. So, I never want to take away from what John Resig did because it is just an incredible piece of software that has done so well. And continues, I think, to influence the way modern JavaScript APIs kind of play out. So all that said, the kind of the smoothing out of browser bugs, I actually maybe dispute the fact that jQuery provides better browser compatibility than vanilla JavaScript does in the absolute sense. So, if you're talking about, say version 1.x, then yeah, I'm on board. That carries some pretty deep backwards compatibility. Once we get into the more modern versions of jQuery, particularly version 3, that has the same browser support as ES6, or ES5 rather, not ES6, and comes in at like I think 85 kilobytes minified. So you're downloading a pretty sizable file, which I know is not necessarily always the end all be all, but it's a decent sized file. It's still got IE9 and up browser support, which is what you get out of ES5. And I don't think there's a ton of warts that it really smooths over. The biggest thing that I really like that jQuery does that vanilla doesn't is it fails silently if you don't find an element. So like for example, if I'm using query selector and I look for an element and then I go to do something with that element. If that element wasn't found in vanilla JavaScript, the browser is going to throw an error and fail spectacularly, whereas jQuery is just like, oh, no element, we'll just kind of move on with our life. And there's ways you can kind of get around that too. But yeah, generally speaking, I don't personally feel like there's a ton of warts that jQuery smooths over that vanilla JavaScript doesn't handle perfectly fine. If you're talking i9 and above, if you work at a company that still needs
that was my next question. Were you going to say that is the case given certain browser constraints?
Yeah, and that's for me. That's kind of the big. I started i9 and above, which gets you 99.6% of global web traffic, but may vary depending on your particular audience. So, for example, people who work in a corporate environment where they're running these really terrible legacy web apps that require Internet Explorer run in compatibility mode, or they're still using some hacked or patched version of IE7 on Windows Vista because they just can't upgrade. You have a slightly different use case, and I fully acknowledge that. But yeah, generally speaking, I think the browser compatibility concern is potentially overblown, and it's made even easier now by this really awesome tool from Jonathan Neath and the folks at FT Labs, Polyfill.io, which you may or may not have heard of already. But it's basically an automatic polyfilling service that's at the moment 100% free. That when you load it, it detects what browser your visitor is coming in on and serves them a small polyfill file that is customized for their browser and includes only the polyfills they need. So on the latest version of Chrome 60, it is empty and no polyfills. And on slightly older versions of Chrome and Firefox, you're coming in with somewhere to like 2 to 5 kilobytes of files. And as you get further back into like the IE7 range, it ends up being somewhere closer to like 15 or 20 kilobytes, which is still smaller than jQuery and a whole bunch of other frameworks, but allows you to use all the modern stuff. So it's for me that's like, if I was working in a corporate environment where I had to support those older browsers today, I would much rather use a service like that than turn to jQuery, because it actually supports most things back to IE7, which is surprisingly thorough.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting about polyfill.io is it's supported by the Financial Times, and it has a CDN through Fastly. So while it is a quote unquote little open source project, it's got some backing, and you would not feel sad about putting your app into production on it. And if one day it costs money, well, then pay the money.
Yeah, no, it's I'm using it on my latest project, and it's just been such a boon to be able to work with that. It's been awesome.
Very cool. So folks can find you at gomakethings.com, and you've got a series of guides that they can download and pay for. That you've got a free, is it a daily or weekly? How often does your newsletter come out?
It comes out every day. It's short and sweet. So the idea is something you can read right now versus, kind of having it stack up, and then you have all this stuff to read later. But yeah, that's daily. It's just little tips, tools, links to kind of useful stuff.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. This was great.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.